The auctioneer's hammer fell with a sound like thunder, and the words that followed cut through Susan Howard like a blade through winter air. "Damaged goods," he declared, his voice carrying across the crowded auction yard where men gathered like vultures around carrion. "No respectable man would want her now. What am I bid for this broken woman and her bastard child?" Susan stood on the wooden platform, her arms wrapped protectively around her 3-year-old daughter Karen, feeling the weight of every stare, every whispered judgment. The autumn wind whipped through her threadbare dress, and she could smell the dampness of approaching rain, mixed with the dust kicked up by restless horses and the acrid smoke from the blacksmith's forge. Her husband's debts had brought her to this moment, standing like livestock to be sold to the highest bidder, reduced to nothing more than damaged property in the eyes of these men. The crowd murmured their disapproval, some shaking their heads, others turning away entirely. She had expected this, a widow with a child, no family to speak for her, no dowry to sweeten the arrangement. The scandal of her husband's gambling debts and mysterious death had followed her like a shadow, and now she faced the ultimate humiliation of being auctioned off to pay what he owed. "$5, called out a thin man with yellow teeth, more as a joke than a serious bid. Laughter rippled through the crowd. $3, countered another, his voice thick with mockery. "That's generous for damaged goods." Susan closed her eyes, feeling Karen's small hand clutch at her skirt. She had prepared herself for this moment, told herself she would endure whatever came next for her daughter's sake. But the words still burned, each one a brand against her dignity. Then a voice cut through the jeering like an axe through kindling. $100. The crowd fell silent. Susan opened her eyes and saw him then, standing at the back of the gathering like a mountain among men. Lionel Wright was a name whispered in these parts, a man who lived alone in the high country, who came to town only when necessity demanded it. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling out a worn leather coat, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples. His face was weathered by wind and sun, marked by years of solitude and hard living, but his eyes held a clarity that made Susan's breath catch in her throat. The auctioneer stammered, clearly caught off guard by the substantial bid. "Did you say 100, Mr. Wright?" "I did." Lionel's voice carried the weight of finality. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the packed earth. "But I heard you wrong, auctioneer. You called her damaged goods." The man on the platform shifted nervously. "Well, I mean to say she's a widow with a child, and there are circumstances." "Then I'll take every broken piece," Lionel said, his voice rising like distant thunder. The crowd parted before him as he approached the platform. "Every scar, every tear, every part you think makes her less than whole. $100, and I'll consider it the bargain of my lifetime." Susan stared at this mountain of a man who had just defended her honor in front of the entire town. She had never spoken to him directly, though she had seen him occasionally in the general store, always polite but distant, always alone. Now he stood before the auction platform like an avenging angel, his presence commanding respect from men who had been mocking her moments before. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The auctioneer looked around the crowd, waiting for other bids, but the silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Finally, he brought his hammer down. "Sold to Mr. Wright for $100. Lionel stepped up to the platform and extended his hand to Susan. She hesitated for a moment, studying his face. There was no pity there, no calculation, just a quiet strength that seemed to promise safety. She took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work, and allowed him to help her down from the platform. Karen pressed closer to her mother's leg, wide eyes fixed on the tall stranger. "Thank you," Susan whispered, her voice barely audible above the dispersing crowd. Lionel nodded once, then knelt down to Karen's level. "Hello, little one. What's your name?" "Karen," the child replied in a small voice, half hidden behind her mother's skirt. "That's a pretty name. I'm Lionel. I have a cabin up in the mountains where you and your mama will be safe." He stood and looked at Susan again. "We should go. There's weather coming, and it's a long ride to my place." Susan gathered her few possessions, everything she owned fitting into a single worn carpet bag, and followed Lionel to where his horse waited. It was a sturdy mountain horse, built for endurance rather than speed, with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition. Lionel lifted Karen onto the saddle first, then helped Susan up behind her. Hold tight to the saddle horn, he told them both. The trail gets rough in places. He swung up behind them, his arms coming around both mother and child to grasp the reins. Susan felt the solid warmth of his chest against her back and caught the scent of pine smoke and leather that seemed to cling to his clothes. It had been so long since she had felt protected, since someone had stood between her and the harsh judgments of the world. They rode in silence as the town fell away behind them, the trail climbing steadily into the foothills of the mountains. The aspens were turning gold with autumn's touch, their leaves whispering secrets in the wind. Susan found herself relaxing despite the uncertainty of her situation. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than the humiliation she had just endured. The trail wound higher, following a creek that danced over smooth stones, its voice a constant companion as they climbed. Karen had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse's gait. Susan marveled at her daughter's resilience, her ability to find peace even in the midst of such upheaval. "How much farther?" she asked quietly, not wanting to wake Karen. "Another hour," Lionel replied. "The cabin's in a valley, sheltered from the worst of the weather. There's good water and plenty of game." Susan nodded, though he couldn't see the gesture. She wanted to ask him why he had bid on her, why he had chosen to take on the burden of a woman and child he barely knew. But something in his manner suggested that explanations would come in their own time. The sun was beginning to set behind the peaks when they finally reached the valley. Susan gasped at the beauty of it, a hidden bowl surrounded by towering pines and granite cliffs. A small lake reflected the last light of day like a mirror, and at the far end, nestled against a stand of aspen trees, stood a log cabin that looked as solid and permanent as the mountains themselves. Lionel helped them down from the horse and led the way to the cabin. The door was made of thick planks bound with iron, and when he pushed it open, Susan was surprised by the warmth and comfort within. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, and the main room was furnished with handmade furniture that spoke of skill and patience. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books that seemed incongruous in this wilderness setting. "I wasn't expecting company," Lionel said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "But there's a room where you and Karen can sleep. I'll take the loft." He showed them to a small bedroom off the main room, simply furnished but clean and warm. A window looked out over the lake, and Susan could imagine waking to that view each morning. It seemed like a dream after the cramped, cold rooms she had called home in town. "There's food in the pantry," Lionel said. "Help yourself to whatever you need. I'll tend to the horse and bring in some more firewood." He left them alone, and Susan sank onto the edge of the bed, Karen still sleeping in her arms. The events of the day seemed to catch up with her all at once, and she felt tears threatening to spill over. She had been saved from a fate that could have been far worse. But at what cost? What did this mountain man expect from her? What kind of arrangement had she entered into? When Lionel returned with an armload of wood, he found Susan sitting by the fire, Karen playing quietly at her feet with a corn husk doll that had seen better days. The firelight played across Susan's face, highlighting the delicate bone structure that spoke of better times before worry and hardship had carved lines around her eyes. "You don't have to be afraid," he said quietly, stacking the wood beside the fireplace. "I know what you must be thinking, but I'm not expecting anything from you at your not willing to give." Susan looked up at him, studying his face in the firelight. "Then why? Why did you bid on me? Why did you bring us here?" Lionel was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the wood he had been arranging. "Because I've been alone up here for 5 years," he said finally. "And in all that time, I've never seen anything as cruel as what happened to you today. No woman should have to endure that kind of humiliation, especially not one who's already lost so much. You know about my husband? I know he died owing money to some dangerous men. I know you've been struggling to keep food on the table and a roof over your head. I know the town has been whispering about you, making up stories to explain what they don't understand." Susan felt heat rise in her cheeks. "And what do you think you understand?" Lionel turned to face her fully, his gray eyes steady and calm. "I think you're a woman who's been dealt a hard hand and has played it as well as anyone could. I think you love your daughter more than your own life, and I think you deserve better than what this world has given you so far." The simple honesty in his words broke something loose inside Susan's chest. She had been holding herself together through sheer force of will for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone see her as more than a burden or a problem to be solved. "I can cook and clean," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can earn my keep." "I'm sure you can, but that's not why you're here." "Then why?" Lionel looked out the window toward the darkening lake. "Because everyone deserves a place where they can heal. Everyone deserves to be seen as whole, regardless of what the world has taken from them." That night, Susan lay awake listening to the sounds of the wilderness settling around them. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate, and the wind sighed through the pine boughs like a lullaby. Beside her, Karen slept peacefully, her small body warm and trusting. For the first time in months, Susan felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. In the loft above, Lionel stared at the ceiling beams he had hewn and fitted with his own hands. He had built this cabin as a refuge from a world that had shown him its capacity for cruelty, a place where he could live by his own rules and answer to no one. Now he had brought two strangers into his sanctuary, and he wasn't entirely sure what had possessed him to do it. But when he had seen Susan standing on that platform, holding her child and facing the mockery of the crowd with quiet dignity, something in his chest had twisted tight. He had recognized something in her face, a look he had seen in his own mirror too many times to count. The look of someone who had been broken by circumstances beyond their control, but was still fighting to hold the pieces together. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the meadow grass silver. Susan woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and when she emerged from the bedroom with Karen, she found Lionel at the stove, tending a skillet with the easy competence of a man long accustomed to caring for himself. "Good morning," he said without turning around. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Susan admitted. It was true, the mountain air and the absence of worry about immediate survival had given her the first truly restful sleep she had enjoyed since her husband's death. Lionel served them breakfast at a table he had built from a single massive pine log, the surface polished smooth by years of use. The bacon was perfectly cooked, the eggs fresh from chickens she hadn't yet seen, and the coffee was strong and hot. Karen ate with the enthusiasm of a child who had known too many meals of thin soup and stale bread. "What will you do today?" Susan asked, uncertain of the rhythm of life in this isolated place. "Check the traps, split some wood for winter. The usual things." Lionel paused, then added, "You're welcome to explore the valley if you like. There's a path around the lake that's safe enough. Just stay within sight of the cabin." Susan nodded, grateful for the freedom implied in his words. She had half expected to find herself confined, a prisoner in a comfortable cage. Instead, Lionel seemed to be offering her the space to find her own way in this new life. After breakfast, he showed her the practical aspects of the homestead. The chicken coop, well-built and secure against predators. The root cellar, stocked with vegetables and preserved meat. The workshop where he crafted the furniture and tools that made their life possible. Everything spoke of careful planning and skilled hands, of a man who had thought deeply about what it meant to live apart from the world. "You built all this yourself?" Susan asked, running her hand along the smooth wood of a workbench. "Had to. Nearest neighbor is 20 miles down the mountain, and he's not much for lending tools." There was a story there, Susan sensed, but she didn't press. They were both carrying histories that had driven them to this moment, and she understood the value of letting the past reveal itself slowly. That afternoon, while Lionel was checking his trap lines, Susan walked the path around the lake with Karen. The child delighted in everything she saw, from the chipmunks that chattered at them from the safety of the trees to the fish that rose to dimple the surface of the water. It occurred to Susan that this was the first time in Karen's short life that she had been able to play without the constant worry of where their next meal would come from. They found a fallen log near the water's edge and sat together, watching the light dance on the surface of the lake. Karen picked up smooth stones and tried to skip them, laughing when they sank immediately instead of dancing across the water. "Mama," Karen said suddenly, "is the big man going to send us away?" Susan felt her heart clench. "Why would you think that, sweetheart?" "Because everyone always sends us away." The simple truth of it hit Susan like a physical blow. In the months since her husband's death, they had been forced to move 3 times as landlords found excuses to evict them. Karen had learned to expect rejection, to prepare for the moment when they would have to pack their few belongings and search for another place that might accept them. "This is different," Susan said, pulling her daughter close. "Mr. Wright isn't like the others." "How do you know?" It was a fair question, and one Susan couldn't answer with certainty. But something in Lionel's manner, in the way he had knelt to Karen's level and spoken to her as an equal, suggested a man who understood what it meant to be cast out from the world. "I just do," she said finally. "Sometimes you have to trust your heart, even when your mind tells you to be careful." When Lionel returned that evening, he brought with him 2 rabbits and a string of trout. Susan offered to help prepare the meal, and they worked together in comfortable silence, their movements gradually finding a rhythm that spoke of domestic harmony. Karen sat by the fire, playing with wooden blocks that Lionel had carved for her that afternoon. "She's a bright child," Lionel observed, watching Karen stack the blocks into elaborate structures. "She is. She deserves better than what I've been able to give her. She deserves a mother who loves her enough to do whatever it takes to keep her safe. That's exactly what you've given her." Susan felt tears prick at her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged her sacrifices, had seen her struggles as anything other than personal failings. As the days passed, they settled into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. Susan took over the cooking and the care of the chickens, finding satisfaction in tasks that contributed to their shared survival. Lionel taught Karen to fish in the lake, his patience endless as she tangled lines and scared away fish with her excited chatter. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire while Lionel read aloud from his collection of books. Susan was surprised by the breadth of his library, volumes of poetry and philosophy mixed with practical manuals on farming and animal husbandry. His voice was deep and resonant, perfect for the dramatic passages of Shakespeare or the rolling cadences of Whitman. "Where did you learn to read like that?" Susan asked one night after he had finished a particularly moving passage from Hamlet. "My mother was a teacher before she married my father. She believed that education was the one thing no one could take away from you, no matter how poor you became." Was she right? Lionel considered the question, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Mostly, though I've learned that knowledge without wisdom can be a dangerous thing." There was pain in his voice, old and deep, and Susan recognized it as the sound of someone who had paid a high price for hard-won understanding. She wanted to ask what had brought him to this mountain refuge, what had driven him away from the world below, but she sensed that the story would come when he was ready to tell it. The first snow came early that year, dusting the peaks with white while the valley still held the warmth of autumn. Susan woke to find the world transformed, every branch and blade of grass outlined in crystal. Karen pressed her face to the window, marveling at the beauty of it. "Will we be trapped here all winter?" Susan asked Lionel over breakfast. "The trail down the mountain becomes impassable once the heavy snows start," he admitted. "But we have everything we need: food, fuel, shelter. We'll be fine." The prospect of months of isolation might have terrified Susan a few weeks ago. Now, looking around the warm cabin with its well-stocked pantry and comfortable furnishings, she felt only a deep sense of security. Whatever the winter brought, they would face it together. That afternoon, Lionel began teaching Susan to shoot. He led her to a clearing behind the cabin where he had set up targets against a backdrop of fallen logs. "Every person living in the wilderness needs to know how to handle a rifle," he explained, showing her how to hold the weapon properly. Not just for hunting, but for protection. Susan had never held a gun before, and the weight of it felt strange in her hands. But Lionel was a patient teacher, adjusting her stance and showing her how to sight down the barrel. When she finally hit the target, the satisfaction was immediate and surprising. "Why are you teaching me this?" she asked as they walked back to the cabin. "Because I won't always be here to protect you and Karen. You need to know you can take care of yourself." The casual way he spoke of his potential absence sent a chill through Susan. "Are you planning to leave?" Lionel stopped walking and turned to face her. "No. But life has a way of making plans for us whether we want them or not. I want to know that you'll be all right, whatever happens." That night, Susan lay awake thinking about his words. She had grown comfortable in their arrangement, perhaps too comfortable. It was easy to forget that she was here because of a business transaction, that Lionel had paid for her like any other piece of property. The fact that he treated her with respect and kindness didn't change the fundamental nature of their relationship. Or did it? As the weeks passed, she began to notice small things. The way Lionel's eyes followed her as she moved around the cabin. The care he took in preparing meals when it was his turn to cook, as if her opinion of the food mattered to him. The gentle way he spoke to Karen, as if she were his own daughter rather than the child of a woman he had bought at auction. And she noticed her own responses to him. The way her pulse quickened when their hands accidentally touched as they worked together. The comfort she found in his presence. The sense that she could trust him with her life and her daughter's life. The growing awareness that what she felt for him was far more than gratitude. The revelation came to her gradually, like dawn breaking over the mountains. She was falling in love with Lionel Wright, this quiet man who had rescued her from humiliation and given her a home in the wilderness. The knowledge terrified her because she had no idea if he felt anything for her beyond the basic compassion that had moved him to bid on her in the first place. One evening in late November, as the first serious snowfall of the season began to dust the valley, Susan found Lionel standing on the cabin's front porch, staring out at the darkening sky. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and joined him, their breath visible in the cold air. "It's beautiful," she said, watching the fat flakes drift down like feathers. "It is. But it also means we're truly cut off now. The trail will be impassable until spring." There was something in his voice that made Susan look at him more closely. "Does that worry you?" "Not the isolation. I've spent 5 winters alone up here. But this year is different." "Because of us?" Lionel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the falling snow. "Because of you," he said finally. "Because I've grown to care for you and Karen in ways I didn't expect. And because I'm not sure I have the right to feel that way." Susan's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" "I bought you, Susan, paid money for you like you were livestock. How can I ask you to care for me when the foundation of our relationship is built on something so fundamentally wrong?" She turned to face him fully, seeing the torment in his expression. "Is that what you think? That I'm here because I have no choice?" "Aren't you?" Susan reached out and took his hand, feeling the familiar calluses and the strength beneath his skin. "I stayed in that room the first night because I had nowhere else to go. I helped with the cooking and cleaning because I wanted to earn my keep. But I'm standing here now in the snow, talking to you about feelings, because I choose to be here, because this is where I want to be." Lionel's fingers tightened around hers. "Susan, you didn't buy a slave at that auction, Lionel. You bought me time. Time to heal, time to find my strength again, time to discover what I really want from life. And what I want is to build something real with you, if you'll have me." He turned to face her then, his gray eyes searching her face in the dim light. "Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. I'm not a man who loves lightly, and I'm not a man who lets go easily." "I'm sure," Susan whispered. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Lionel cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Love you," he said, the words rough with emotion. "I've loved you since the day I saw you standing on that platform, holding your daughter and facing down a crowd of men who thought they had the right to judge you. You were the bravest thing I'd ever seen." "I was terrified," Susan confessed. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. You've shown me more courage in the past 2 months than I've seen in most men in a lifetime." When he kissed her, it was with the gentle reverence of a man who understood the precious nature of what he held. Susan felt something deep inside her chest unfold like a flower greeting the sun, a sense of coming home that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with finding the person who saw her truly and loved what he saw. They were married on Christmas Eve, with Karen serving as their only witness. Lionel had carved a simple ring from mountain laurel, and Susan wore a dress she had sewn from fabric he had brought back from his last trip to town before the snows closed the passes. The ceremony was brief, the words spoken before the fire that had become the heart of their home, but the promises they made to each other carried the weight of absolute commitment. That winter passed like a dream. The 3 of them were snowed in for 4 months, but the isolation felt like a gift rather than a hardship. They were cocooned in their valley, safe from the judgments and expectations of the outside world. free to build their family in the way that felt right to them. Lionel taught Karen to read, his patience endless as she struggled with difficult words. Susan learned to spin wool from the sheep Lionel kept in a sheltered pasture, her hands gradually mastering the rhythm of the wheel. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire while Lionel carved toys for Karen, or Susan mended clothes, their conversation ranging from practical matters to philosophical discussions that lasted deep into the night. But it was in the quiet moments that Susan treasured most. The way Lionel would touch her hand as he passed her chair, the sound of his laughter when Karen told one of her elaborate stories, the feeling of absolute safety that settled over her as she lay beside him at night, listening to the winds sing through the pines. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the valley into a paradise of wildflowers and rushing water. The lake, which had been frozen solid for months, began to break up with sounds like thunder. Great sheets of ice grinding against each other as the current underneath fought to be free. "We should go to town," Lionel said one morning as they stood watching the ice break up. "Get married legally, make sure Karen's adoption papers are filed properly." Susan felt a moment of panic. The outside world seemed like a distant nightmare, a place where she had been humiliated and judged. "Do we have to?" "Not if you don't want to. But I want the world to know you're my wife. I want them to know that Karen is my daughter in every way that matters. And I want to make sure that if anything happens to me, you'll both be provided for." The practical considerations were undeniable, but Susan still felt reluctant to leave their sanctuary. What if they don't accept the marriage? What if they say terrible things? Lionel took her hands in his expression serious. "Then we'll deal with it together. But Susan, you're not the same woman who stood on that auction platform 6 months ago. You found your strength again. And anyone who has a problem with our marriage will have to answer to me." The trip to town was everything Susan had feared and more. The stares followed them from the moment they rode down the main street, whispers trailing in their wake like smoke. But this time, Susan held her head high. She rode beside her husband, her daughter secure in her arms, and she met every curious gaze with calm dignity. The marriage ceremony at the courthouse was brief and businesslike, but Susan didn't care about the lack of ceremony. What mattered was the look in Lionel's eyes as he slipped a proper gold ring onto her finger, the way he introduced her to the clerk as "my wife," with unmistakable pride in his voice. They were leaving the courthouse when they encountered Adam Campbell, one of the men who had bid on Susan at the auction. He was drunk despite the early hour, his face flushed with whiskey and malice. "Well, well," he slurred, blocking their path. "If it isn't the mountain mist and his damaged goods. How's married life treating you, right? Getting your money's worth?" Lionel stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. "You'll watch your tongue when you speak about my wife." "Your wife?" Campbell laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "She's a whore who couldn't keep her husband from gambling away everything they owned. What makes you think she won't do the same to you?" The words hit Susan like physical blows, each one designed to wound. But before she could react, Lionel had moved. His fist connected with Campbell's jaw with a sound like an axe hitting wood, and the smaller man went down hard, blood streaming from his mouth. "Get up," Lionel said, his voice deadly calm. "Get up and apologize to my wife, or I'll finish what you started." Campbell struggled to his feet, spitting blood. "This isn't over, right? You can't protect her forever." "I can try," Lionel replied, "and I suggest you remember that before you open your mouth about her again." They rode out of town in tense silence, Karen sleeping peacefully in Susan's arms, unaware of the ugliness that had just unfolded. It wasn't until they were well into the foothills that Susan finally spoke. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm sorry you had to defend me like that." Lionel reined in his horse and turned to look at her. "Susan, listen to me. You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. Campbell is a drunk and a fool, and his opinion means less than nothing to me. But what he said about my husband, about the gambling, what about it? Your husband made his choices, and they had consequences. That doesn't reflect on you or make you any less worthy of respect." Susan felt tears threatening again. "Sometimes I wonder if I could have stopped him, if I had been a better wife." "Stop," Lionel's voice was firm but gentle. "I won't let you torture yourself with what-ifs. You did the best you could with the situation you were given. That's all anyone can do." They continued up the mountain in contemplative silence, the town falling away behind them like a bad dream. As they climbed higher, Susan felt the tension leaving her shoulders. This was their world now, these mountains and valleys, this life they had built together away from the judgment of small minds. That evening, as they sat by the fire in their cabin, Lionel pulled out a leather portfolio Susan had never seen before. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his expression serious, "about why I came to live up here, about the life I left behind." Susan set down her mending and gave him her full attention. She had been wondering about his past for months, but had never pressed for details. "I was a lawyer once," Lionel began, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "Had a practice in Denver, a house in the best part of town, all the things that were supposed to matter. I was engaged to a woman named Elizabeth, daughter of a prominent family. Everything was arranged, everything was perfect." He paused, staring into the fire. "Then I took a case that changed everything. A mining company was cheating its workers, paying them in scrip that was worthless anywhere but the company store. The workers were trapped in a cycle of debt they could never escape. I thought I could help them, thought justice would prevail if I just presented the facts clearly enough. What happened? The mining company owned half the judges in the territory and most of the politicians. My clients lost their jobs, their homes, everything. Some of them died that winter when they couldn't afford food or fuel, and I learned that justice is a luxury that only the wealthy can afford." Susan reached out and took his hand, feeling the pain that still lived in his memories. "Elizabeth's father was one of the investors in the mining company," Lionel continued. "When I wouldn't drop the case, she broke our engagement, said she couldn't marry a man who didn't understand how the world really worked. Her father made sure I couldn't get work anywhere in the territory. So I came up here, built this cabin, and tried to forget that I had ever believed in anything as naive as justice." "But you saved me," Susan said softly. "You stood up to that entire crowd and defended my honor when no one else would. That sounds like justice to me." Lionel looked at her then, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "Maybe, or maybe I just couldn't stand to see another person broken by a system that values property over people. Either way, I'm grateful. We both are." As if summoned by her words, Karen appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mama, I had a bad dream." Susan opened her arms, and Karen climbed into her lap, snuggling against her mother's warmth. Lionel watched them both, his expression soft with love. "What was your dream about, little one?" he asked gently. "The bad men came and took you away," Karen said, her voice muffled against Susan's shoulder. "They said we couldn't stay here anymore." Lionel knelt beside Susan's chair and reached out to stroke Karen's hair. "That's not going to happen, sweetheart. This is our home, and no one can take it away from us. Promise, Laws?" "I promise." But even as he spoke the words, Lionel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Campbell's parting words echoed in his mind. This isn't over. He had made an enemy today, and enemies had a way of finding opportunities for revenge when you least expected them. The summer that followed was the happiest of Susan's life. She tended a garden that flourished in the mountain soil, preserved vegetables and fruits for the coming winter, and watched Karen grow strong and confident in the freedom of their valley. The child had lost the pinched, worried look that had marked her features in town, and her laughter rang across the water of the lake like music. Lionel built an addition to the cabin, a larger bedroom for him and Susan, and a separate room for Karen. He also constructed a schoolroom where he continued Karen's education, determined that she would have every advantage he could provide. "She's bright enough to go to college someday," he told Susan one evening as they watched Karen practice her letters at the kitchen table. "College?" Susan was amazed by the possibility. "But we're so far from everything up here." "Not forever. When she's old enough, if she wants to pursue higher education, we'll find a way to make it happen. No child should have their dreams limited by circumstances beyond their control." Susan heard the echo of his own lost opportunities in those words and loved him even more for his determination to give Karen what he had been denied. But their peace was not to last. In late August, as the aspen leaves were just beginning to hint at their autumn gold, a stranger appeared in their valley. Susan was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she saw him, a lone rider picking his way carefully down the trail from the pass. Something about his posture, The way he sat his horse sent alarm bells ringing in her mind. She dropped the wet sheet she had been holding and ran toward the cabin. "Lionel," she called, her voice sharp with fear. He emerged from the workshop, a half-finished chair in his hands, and followed her gaze to the approaching rider. His expression darkened as he recognized the man. "Christopher Allen," he said grimly, "Campbell's brother-in-law. Take Karen inside and stay there." "Who is he? What does he want?" "Nothing good." Lionel set down the chair and walked toward the house, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Go on, Susan. Do as I say." Susan gathered Karen from where she had been playing by the lake and hurried into the cabin, but she positioned herself by the window where she could see what was happening. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the stranger dismount and approach Lionel. Christopher Allen was a thin, sharp-featured man with the cold eyes of a snake. He wore the clothes of a town dweller, expensive but impractical for mountain travel, and his horse showed signs of being pushed hard on the difficult trail. "Right, baby," he said by way of greeting, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Nice place you have here. Very isolated." "What do you want, Allen?" "Just came to deliver a message from my brother-in-law. He's still smarting from that punch you gave him, and he's been thinking about ways to return the favor. If Campbell has something to say to me, he can come say it himself." Allen smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Oh, he will. But first, he wanted you to know that he's been doing some research into your wife's past. Interesting things, the stories people tell when you buy them enough whiskey." Susan felt ice form in her stomach. What stories? What could Campbell have possibly learned about her? "Her husband didn't just die in a gambling accident," Allen continued, clearly enjoying the effect his words were having. "Seems there were some questions about the circumstances, questions about whether his lovely wife might have had something to do with his unfortunate demise." "You're lying, Eshua," Lionel said, but Susan could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Am I? Ask her, right? Ask your precious wife about the night her husband died. Ask her about the argument they had, about the threats she made. Ask her about the poison that was found in his system." The world seemed to tilt around Susan. She had never told Lionel the complete truth about her husband's death, had never explained the circumstances that had led to the whispered suspicions and the cold shoulders from former friends. Now it was all coming out, twisted and distorted, but containing just enough truth to be believable. "Even if any of that were true," Lionel said, his voice steady despite the bombshell that had just been dropped, "it wouldn't change how I feel about my wife." "Wouldn't it? A man might overlook a lot of things for a pretty face and a warm bed. But murder? That's a different matter entirely." Allen remounted his horse, his message delivered. "Campbell will be back, right? And when he comes, he won't be coming alone. You might want to think about whether your wife is worth dying for." He rode away as suddenly as he had come, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unspoken accusations. Lionel stood in the yard for a long moment, staring after the departing rider, before turning toward the cabin. Susan met him at the door, Karen clinging to her skirts. She could see the questions in his eyes, the doubt that Allen's words had planted. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. Susan closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the secret she had carried for so long. "Some of it. Not the way he told it, but some of it." "Tell me." She sent Karen to her room to play, then sat down at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap. The words came slowly, painfully, like drawing poison from an infected wound. "My husband was a gambler, that much is true, but he was also a drunk and a violent man when he'd been drinking. The night he died, he came home from the saloon in a rage. He'd lost more money than we had, money we needed for food and rent. When I tried to talk to him about it, he hit me." Lionel's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "He said he was going to sell Karen to pay his debts. There were men in town who would pay good money for a pretty little girl," he said. "I told him I'd kill him before I let him touch our daughter." Susan's voice broke on the last words, and she had to pause to collect herself before continuing. "He laughed at me, said I didn't have the spine to hurt a fly. Then he went to Karen's room, and I heard her scream. I don't remember picking up the poker from the fireplace, but suddenly I was standing over him, and he was on the floor bleeding from his head." "You killed him to protect Karen?" I thought I had. But when the doctor examined him, he said the head wound wasn't fatal. It was his heart that killed him, weak from years of drinking. The blow to his head just brought on the attack that was probably coming anyway. Then why the accusations about poison? Susan looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. Because I had been putting laudanum in his whiskey for weeks, trying to keep him calm when he drank. The doctor found traces of it in his blood and jumped to conclusions. By the time the truth came out, the rumors had already started spreading. Lionel was quiet for a long time, processing what she had told him. Finally, he reached across the table and took her hands in his. You were protecting your daughter, and he said simply. Any mother would have done the same thing. But I lied to you. I let you marry me without telling you the truth about what happened. You told me what you were ready to tell me. The rest is just details. Susan stared at him in amazement. Details? Lionel, people think I'm a murderer. People think a lot of things. Most of them are wrong. He stood up and pulled her into his arms. Susan, I don't care what happened in your past. I care about who you are now, about the woman who loves her daughter enough to face down the world for her, about the woman who brought light back into my life when I thought I'd lost it forever. But what if Campbell comes back? What if he brings the law with him? Then we'll deal with it together. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the wind in the pines, Susan felt a peace she hadn't known since the night her husband died. She had told Lionel the truth, the whole ugly truth, and he hadn't turned away from her. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family. But in the darkness beyond their valley, forces were already in motion that would test that resolve to its limits. Campbell had not been idle during the weeks since his encounter with Lionel in town. The humiliation of being knocked down in front of witnesses had festered in his mind like an infected wound, and he had spent his time gathering allies in planning his revenge. The plan was simple in its cruelty. He would return to the valley with enough men to overwhelm Lionel's defenses, take Susan and Karen as evidence in the murder case he was fabricating, and leave the mountain man to face the consequences of his defiance. If Lionel resisted, so much the better. A dead man couldn't testify about the circumstances of his wife's arrest. Campbell had recruited 5 other men for his expedition, promising them shares in the reward money he claimed was being offered for Susan's capture. They were rough men, the kind who asked no questions as long as the pay was good, and they had no qualms about what they might have to do to accomplish their mission. They set out from town on a crisp September morning, taking the old mining trail that would bring them to Lionel's Valley from the north, avoiding the main path where they might be spotted. Campbell had studied maps and questioned old-timers who knew the mountains, and he was confident they could reach the cabin undetected. Meanwhile, in the valley, life continued its peaceful rhythm. Susan had put up the last of the vegetables from her garden, and the root cellar was well stocked for the coming winter. Karen was making good progress with her reading, and Lionel had begun teaching her basic mathematics. The threat represented by Campbell's visit seemed distant and unreal in the face of their daily routines. But Lionel had not forgotten Alan's warning. He had increased his vigilance, checking the approaches to the valley more frequently and making sure his weapons were always close at hand. He had also begun teaching Susan more advanced shooting techniques, and she had proven to be a quick and accurate student. Why are you pushing so hard with this? Susan asked one afternoon after a particularly intensive training session. Because I have a feeling we're going to need every advantage we can get, Lionel replied grimly. Campbell isn't the type to let a slight go unanswered, and he has resources I don't. What kind of resources? Money, connections, men who will do whatever he asks as long as the price is right. I'm just one man, Susan. If he comes at us with enough force, I might not be able to protect you and Karen. The thought terrified Susan, but she forced herself to face it squarely. Then we'll have to be ready to protect ourselves. That evening, as they sat by the fire after Karen had gone to bed, Lionel pulled out a map of the surrounding mountains and spread it on the table. If something happens to me, he said, ignoring Susan's protest, you need to know how to get out of here. There's an old trapper's trail that leads over the ridge to the east. It's rough going, but it connects with a wagon road about 10 miles down. From there, you could reach the territorial capital in 3 days. Lionel, stop. Nothing is going to happen to you. I hope not, but hope isn't a strategy. He pointed to various landmarks on the map. There's a cache of supplies hidden here at the base of Eagle Rock. Food, ammunition, a little money, enough to get you and Karen to safety if you need it. Susan studied the map, memorizing the route despite her reluctance to consider the possibility that she might need it. Why are you telling me this now? Because I've been having dreams. Bad dreams, and my dreams have a way of coming true. The attack came 3 days later, just as the first snow of the season began to dust the higher peaks. Susan was in the garden, harvesting the last of the root vegetables, when she heard the crack of a rifle shot echoing across the valley. She dropped her basket and ran toward the cabin, calling for Karen. The child emerged from the chicken coop where she had been gathering eggs, her face white with fear. "Mama, what was that noise?" "Get in the house, quickly." Susan grabbed Karen's hand and pulled her toward the cabin, her mind racing. Where was Lionel? He had gone to check the trap lines that morning and should have been back by now. Another shot rang out, closer this time, and Susan saw smoke rising from the direction of the workshop. Her heart sank as she realized what was happening. Campbell had come, and he had brought friends. She got Karen inside and barricaded the door, then grabbed the rifle Lionel had taught her to use. Through the window, she could see men moving through the trees, at least 4 of them that she could count. They were spreading out, surrounding the cabin, cutting off any chance of escape. "Mama, I'm scared," Karen whispered, clinging to her mother's skirt. "I know, sweetheart, but remember what Lionel taught us about being brave? Sometimes we have to do scary things to protect the people we love." A voice called out from the yard, Campbell's voice, thick with mock concern. "Mrs. Wright, come out and talk to us. We just want to have a conversation about your late husband." Susan didn't reply, but she positioned herself at the window where she could see the front of the cabin. Campbell stood in the open, confident in his superior numbers, a cruel smile playing around his lips. "We know you're in there, Susan, and we know you're alone. Your husband won't be coming to help you this time." The words hit Susan like a physical blow. What had they done to Lionel? Was he dead? Wounded? The not knowing was almost worse than the immediate danger they faced. "Tell you what," Campbell continued, "you come out peacefully, bring the kid with you, and we'll make sure no harm comes to either of you. You have my word as a gentleman." Susan almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Campbell's word was worth less than nothing, and they both knew it. But she needed to buy time, needed to think of a way out of this trap. "What do you want with us?" she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just justice, ma'am, justice for your poor murdered husband. The territorial marshal is very interested in hearing your side of the story." It was a lie, of course. There was no marshal, no official interest in her husband's death. This was purely personal. Campbell's revenge dressed up in the language of law and order. A shot splintered the wood near the window, and Susan ducked back, pulling Karen with her. The time for talking was over. "Listen to me, sweetheart," she whispered to her daughter. "I need you to go to our bedroom and hide under the bed. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. "What about you, Mama?" "I'm going to keep the bad men away from you. Now go, quickly." As Karen disappeared into the bedroom, Susan checked her rifle and took up position by the front window. She could see 2 of the men approaching the cabin from different angles, using the outbuildings for cover. A third was circling toward the back, probably planning to break in through the rear door. She took careful aim at the nearest man and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the man spun around, clutching his arm. He stumbled back toward the trees, cursing loudly. "The bitch can shoot," he yelled to his companions. Campbell's voice rose in anger. "I told you to take her alive. You idiots, she's no good to us dead." But the men were losing patience with the careful approach. More shots rang out, bullets shattering the windows and splintering the wooden walls of the cabin. Susan crawled from window to window, returning fire when she could, but she was badly outnumbered. Then she heard the sound she had been dreading, the back door splintering under the impact of an axe. One of the men had broken through her defenses. Susan spun around as heavy footsteps echoed through the cabin. A bearded man with cold eyes appeared in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen, a pistol in his hand. "Drop the rifle, lady," he commanded. "This is over." Susan's finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could fire, another voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I don't think so." Lionel stood in the shattered remains of the back door, his clothes torn and bloodied, but his rifle steady in his hands. The bearded man started to turn, but Lionel's shot took him in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. "Susan, are you hurt?" "No, but there are more of them outside, at least 4 more." Lionel moved to the front window, his experienced eye taking in the tactical situation at a glance. "They have us surrounded, but they're not professionals. They're bunched up too close together, and they're letting anger cloud their judgment." As if to prove his point, 2 of the remaining men charged the front of the cabin together, firing wildly as they ran. Lionel dropped one with a precise shot to the chest, while Susan wounded the other badly enough to send him crawling back to cover. "That leaves Campbell and one other," Lionel said grimly, "but they'll be more careful now." "How did you get back here? I thought they had killed you." "They tried, set fire to the workshop to flush me out, then opened up on me when I ran for cover. I took a bullet in the shoulder, but I managed to get away through the woods. Took me an hour to circle back." Susan could see the dark stains spreading across his shirt, but there was no time to tend his wound now. Campbell was calling out again, his voice hoarse with rage. "Right, you killed 3 of my men, you bastard. This is between you and me now. Come out and face me like a man." "Stay here with Karen," Lionel told Susan. "Keep her safe no matter what happens." "No." Susan grabbed his arm as he moved toward the door. "I won't let you go out there alone. It's a trap." "Of course it's a trap. But if I don't end this now, Campbell will just come back with more men. This has to finish today." Before Susan could stop him, Lionel opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held ready. Campbell emerged from behind the barn, his own weapon trained on the mountain man. "You should have minded your own business, right?" Campbell snarled. "Should have left well enough alone." "You came to my home and threatened my family," Lionel replied calmly. "That made it my business." "Your family?" Campbell laughed bitterly. "You mean the murdering whore you bought at auction and her bastard child?" The insult hung in the air between them like smoke from a fired gun. Susan watched from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs, as the 2 men faced each other across the yard. "Last chance, Campbell," Lionel said. "Ride away now and don't come back. I won't offer again." "Go to hell." Both men fired simultaneously. Campbell's shot went wide, his aim spoiled by anger and whiskey. Lionel's bullet took him center mass, dropping him to his knees in the dirt of the yard. But even as Campbell fell, Susan saw movement in her peripheral vision. The 5th man, the one she had lost track of, was rising from concealment behind the woodpile, his rifle aimed at Lionel's back. "Lionel!" she screamed, raising her own weapon. Her shot and the hidden gunman's fired at almost the same instant. She felt the bullet whistle past her ear as her own shot found its mark, sending the man tumbling backward over the woodpile. Lionel spun around, his rifle tracking toward the threat that was already neutralized. He looked at Susan with something like awe in his expression. "Nice shooting," he said simply. Campbell was still alive, though fading fast. He looked up at Lionel with hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't over," he gasped. "There will be others. They'll never let you live in peace." "Maybe," Lionel replied, "but they'll have to get past my wife first. And as you just found out, that's not as easy as it looks." Campbell died with a curse on his lips, his blood soaking into the earth of the valley that had become a battleground. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind in the pines and the distant call of a hawk. Susan emerged from the cabin, Karen clinging to her hand, and surveyed the aftermath of the fight. 5 men lay dead in her yard, their blood a stark reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. "Is it over?" Karen asked in a small voice. Lionel knelt down beside her, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. "It's over, little one. The bad men are gone, and they won't be coming back." "Promise?" "I promise, Walmish." But even as he spoke the words, Lionel knew that Campbell had been right about one thing. There would be others, men who saw Susan as easy prey, who thought they could take what didn't belong to them. The fight for their family's safety would never truly be over. That night, after they had buried the dead and tended to Lionel's wound, they sat by the fire and talked about the future. The cabin would need repairs, the workshop would have to be rebuilt, and they would need to be more vigilant than ever. But they were alive, They were together, and they had proven that their love was stronger than the hatred that had tried to destroy them. "I'm proud of you," Lionel told Susan as they prepared for bed. "You saved my life today." "We saved each other," Susan replied. "That's what families do." As winter closed in around their valley, sealing them off from the outside world once again, Susan reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place. She had started as damaged goods on an auction block, a woman with no choices and no hope. Now she was a wife, a mother, a protector of her family. She had found her strength in the crucible of adversity, and she would never be helpless again. The snow fell softly outside their windows, covering the scars of battle and making the world clean and new. In the morning, there would be work to do, preparations to make, a life to rebuild. But tonight, Susan lay in her husband's arms and listened to her daughter's peaceful breathing from the next room, and she knew that she was exactly where she belonged. Spring came early the following year, as if the earth itself was eager to wash away the memories of violence and begin anew. The snow melted in rushing torrents that filled the lake to overflowing, and wildflowers bloomed in profusion across the meadows where blood had once stained the ground. Susan stood in the doorway of the rebuilt workshop, watching Lionel put the finishing touches on a rocking chair he was making for their expected child. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, feeling the flutter of new life growing within her. "It's beautiful," she said, admiring the smooth curves of the wood and the intricate carving along the back. "She'll love it." "She?" Lionel looked up with a smile. "You sound pretty confident about that." "Mother's intuition. Besides, this family could use another strong woman." Karen came running up from the lake, her dress muddy and her face glowing with excitement. At 4 years old, she had grown tall and strong, her confidence blooming like the flowers in Susan's garden. "Mama, Papa, come see what I found," she called, using the name for Lionel that had come naturally to her lips over the winter months. They followed her to the water's edge, where she proudly displayed a collection of smooth stones she had gathered from the shallows. Each one was perfectly round and polished by countless years of water and weather. "They're beautiful, sweetheart," Susan said, admiring the treasures. "What are you going to do with them?" "Make a necklace for the baby," Karen announced, "so she'll know she's part of our family." Lionel knelt down beside her, his expression serious. "That's a wonderful idea, but how do you know the baby will be a girl?" Karen looked at him with the patient expression of a child explaining something obvious to a slow adult. "Because Mama needs another girl to help her with all the work around here. Boys are too messy." Susan and Lionel exchanged amused glances over their daughter's head. The certainty of childhood was a beautiful thing, unmarred by the complications that adults brought to every situation. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, a rider appeared on the trail leading up from the valley floor. Susan felt a familiar tension grip her shoulders, but Lionel's calm demeanor reassured her. "Oh, it's all right," he said quietly. "I recognize him. It's Raymond Brooks, the new territorial marshal. I sent word to him about what happened here last fall." The marshal was a tall, lean man with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He dismounted at the cabin and approached the porch with the easy stride of someone comfortable in wild places. "Mr. Wright, Mrs. Wright," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I apologize for the unexpected visit, but I wanted to speak with you both about the incident involving Adam Campbell and his associates." Susan felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. Had they come to arrest her after all? Were the accusations about her husband's death going to destroy the life they had built together? "Please, sit down," Lionel said, gesturing to one of the chairs he had built. "Can I offer you some coffee? My wife makes the best coffee in the territory." "That's very kind. Thank you." Brooks settled into the chair with a grateful sigh. It's been a long ride up from town. As Susan served coffee and slices of fresh bread, the marshal studied their home with obvious appreciation. "You've built something impressive here. It takes real skill to make a life in country like this." "We've been blessed," Lionel replied carefully, "though it hasn't always been easy." "I imagine not, especially after what happened last fall. I've been investigating Campbell's activities, and I have to say, what I've found doesn't reflect well on him or his associates." Susan set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. "What kind of activities?" "Extortion, mostly. Campbell had a pattern of targeting vulnerable people, particularly women, and using threats or manufactured evidence to extract money from them. You weren't his first victim, Mrs. Wright, and you wouldn't have been his last if your husband hadn't put a stop to it. The relief that flooded through Susan was so intense it made her dizzy. Then you're not here to arrest me? Brooks looked genuinely puzzled. Arrest you? For what? For my husband's death. Campbell claimed there were questions about the circumstances. Ma'am, I've read the coroner's report on your late husband's death. There were no questions about the circumstances. The man died of heart failure brought on by years of alcohol abuse. The laudanum in his system was well within therapeutic levels, consistent with someone trying to manage pain or anxiety. Campbell manufactured that story to use against you. Susan began to cry then, great heaving sobs of relief and release. The weight she had been carrying for over a year, the guilt and fear that had haunted her dreams, suddenly lifted from her shoulders. Lionel moved to her side, wrapping his arms around her and holding her while she wept. There's more, Brooks continued gently. Campbell owed significant gambling debts to some very unsavory characters in Denver. The men he brought with him weren't just hired guns. They were collectors sent to make sure he paid what he owed. When he died here, those debts died with him. You actually did the territory a favor by putting an end to his schemes. I never wanted to kill anyone, Susan whispered. I just wanted to protect my family. And that's exactly what you did. You have nothing to feel guilty about, Mrs. Wright. Nothing at all. The marshal stayed for dinner, entertaining Karen with stories of his travels and complimenting Susan on her cooking. As the evening wore on, Susan found herself relaxing completely for the first time in months. The shadow of her past had finally been lifted, and she was free to embrace her future without reservation. After Brooks left the next morning, promising to send word if any other threats emerged, Susan walked through her garden in the early morning light. The vegetables were coming up strong and healthy, promising another abundant harvest. The fruit trees Lionel had planted were heavy with blossoms, and the herb gardens she had started filled the air with fragrant promise. This was her domain now, this valley hidden in the mountains where she had found love and safety and the chance to become the woman she was meant to be. She was no longer the frightened, desperate creature who had stood on an auction block and heard herself called damaged goods. She was Susan Wright, wife and mother, protector of her family and keeper of their home. The baby arrived on a warm day in late July, when the wildflowers were at their peak and the lake sparkled like diamonds in the afternoon sun. Susan had insisted on having the birth at home, with only Lionel and Karen to help her, and the process had been surprisingly easy compared to Karen's difficult birth years earlier. Their daughter was perfect, with dark hair like her father's, and the same gray eyes that seemed to see everything. They named her Hope because that was what she represented to all of them. The promise that their family would continue to grow and thrive despite everything the world might throw at them. Karen was enchanted with her new sister, spending hours sitting beside the cradle and telling the baby elaborate stories about the animals in the forest and the fish in the lake. She had strung her collection of smooth stones into a necklace as promised, and it hung above Hope's bed like a talisman against harm. She's going to be spoiled rotten, Susan observed one afternoon, watching Karen feed the baby with careful concentration. Good, Lionel replied firmly. She should know from the very beginning that she's loved and valued and protected. She should never have to doubt her worth the way her mother did. Susan looked at him with surprise. It was rare for Lionel to refer directly to her past struggles, though she knew he thought about them often. I don't doubt my worth anymore, she said softly. You made sure of that. No, Susan, you made sure of that. I just gave you the space and time to remember who you really are. That autumn, as the aspen leaves turned gold and the first frost touched the high meadows, they received another visitor. This time it was a young woman, travel-worn and frightened, leading a horse that limped badly from a stone bruise. Susan recognized the look in the woman's eyes immediately, the desperate hope mixed with bone-deep fear that she remembered from her own darkest days. Without hesitation, she opened the cabin door and invited the stranger inside. My name is Cheryl Gonzalez, the woman said, accepting a cup of hot coffee with hands that shook from exhaustion. I've been traveling for 3 days, trying to reach the territorial capital. My horse went lame this morning, and I saw the smoke from your chimney. You're safe here, Susan assured her. Tell us what's wrong. The story that emerged was depressingly familiar. Cheryl had been married to a man who turned violent when he drank, which was increasingly often. When she finally found the courage to leave him, taking their young son with her, her husband had followed them, threatening to kill them both if she didn't return. He has friends in the sheriff's office, Cheryl explained, tears streaming down her face. They won't help me. They say it's a domestic matter, that I should go back to my husband and try to work things out. Susan and Lionel exchanged glances. They both knew how this story would end if Cheryl was forced to return to her abusive marriage. Where's your son now? Susan asked. Hidden in the woods with the horses. I was afraid to bring him up to the house until I knew it was safe. Lionel, go get the boy, Susan said, and check on that lame horse while you're at it. While Lionel was gone, Susan sat with Cheryl and listened to the full story of her marriage and escape. It was a tale of escalating violence and control, of a woman trapped by law and custom in a situation that was slowly killing her spirit. What will you do if you reach the capital? Susan asked. I have a sister there who might take us in. She married well, and her husband has some influence. I'm hoping they can help me get a legal separation. Susan nodded, though she knew the chances of a woman obtaining a divorce, even from an abusive husband, were slim. The law was written by men for the benefit of men, and women like Cheryl were expected to endure whatever their husbands chose to inflict upon them. When Lionel returned with a boy of about 6 years old, Susan's heart broke a little more. The child was thin and hollow-eyed, with the wary posture of someone who had learned to expect violence from the adults who were supposed to protect him. This is my son, Miguel, Cheryl said, gathering the boy close. Miguel, these are the nice people I told you about. The boy nodded politely but said nothing, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the cabin as if memorizing escape routes. Your horse will be fine with a few days' rest, Lionel reported. But you shouldn't travel alone with winter coming on. The passes can become dangerous without warning. I don't have a choice, Cheryl replied. If I stay here, he'll find me. He always finds me. Susan made a decision that surprised even her. Then we'll go with you. Both Lionel and Cheryl stared at her in shock. Susan, Lionel said carefully, we have a newborn baby. We can't make a journey like that. We can't let them go alone either. Look at that child, Lionel. Look at what fear has done to him. If we send them away and something happens to them, how will we live with ourselves? Lionel studied her face, seeing the determination there that he had learned not to argue with. What are you proposing? We escort them to the capital. All of us, as a family. It will take longer with the babies, but we can make it if we're careful. And once we're there, we can make sure they're truly safe before we come home. And if Cheryl's husband follows us, if he brings men like Campbell did, Susan's hand moved instinctively to the rifle that hung above the fireplace. Then we deal with it the same way we dealt with Campbell. The journey to the territorial capital took 2 weeks, traveling slowly to accommodate the children and the recovering horse. They made camp each night in defensible positions, and Lionel taught Cheryl to shoot while Susan cared for the babies and kept watch. Miguel gradually began to open up, his natural curiosity overcoming his learned wariness. Karen appointed herself his protector and guide, showing him how to find the best berries and how to catch fish with his bare hands. The sight of the two children playing together, their laughter echoing across the campsites, gave Susan hope that healing was possible, even for those who had been damaged young. They reached the capital without incident, and Cheryl's sister proved to be everything she had hoped. The woman was horrified by her sister's story and immediately set about arranging legal protection and a safe place to live. Her husband, a successful merchant with political connections, promised to ensure that Cheryl's abusive husband would face consequences if he tried to follow them. I can never repay you for what you've done, Cheryl told Susan on their last evening together. You saved our lives. You would have done the same for us, Susan replied. That's what women do for each other when the world fails us. The return journey to their valley was peaceful, giving Susan time to reflect on how much her life had changed. 2 years ago, she had been the one fleeing in desperation, seeking sanctuary wherever she could find it. Now she was the one offering sanctuary to others, strong enough to protect not just her own family, but anyone who needed help. When they finally reached home, the cabin looked smaller than Susan remembered, but more precious than ever. This was their sanctuary, their fortress against the cruelties of the world, and they had proven once again that love and determination could triumph over hatred and violence. Winter settled over the valley like a familiar friend, bringing with it the deep peace that Susan had learned to treasure. The cabin was warm and full of life, with baby Hope growing stronger each day, and Karen teaching Miguel's memory to her new sister through elaborate games and stories. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside their windows, Susan stood at the kitchen counter preparing dinner and reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years ago, she had been auctioned off like livestock, a woman with no choices and no hope for the future. Now she was surrounded by family, secure in love, and strong enough to help others find their own path to safety. Lionel came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as he watched her work. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "Just remembering," as Susan replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Thinking about how different everything is now. Do you ever regret it, the life we've built here so far from everything?" Susan turned in his arms and looked up at his weathered face, seeing the love and concern in his gray eyes. "Never. This is exactly where I belong, with exactly the people I belong with. Even though it's been hard, even though we've had to fight for it, especially because we've had to fight for it. Nothing worth having comes easy, and what we have is worth everything." From the main room came the sound of Karen reading to Hope, her young voice carefully sounding out the words from one of Lionel's books. The baby couldn't understand the story yet, but she seemed to enjoy the sound of her sister's voice, gurgling and reaching for the pages with tiny hands. "She's going to be a reader like her papa," Susan observed. "Both of them are. I'll make sure they have every opportunity I can give them, every chance to become whatever they want to be." "They already have the most important thing," Susan said. "They have a family that loves them unconditionally, that will protect them no matter what. They'll never have to doubt their worth or stand alone against the world." As if summoned by their conversation, Karen appeared in the kitchen doorway, Hope cradled carefully in her arms. "Mama, Papa, Hope wants to help with Christmas dinner," she announced solemnly. Susan laughed and took the baby, who immediately began trying to grab the wooden spoon Susan had been using. "I think she's a little young for cooking, sweetheart." "But she can watch and learn," Karen insisted. "That's how I learned everything, by watching you and Papa." "You're absolutely right," Lionel said, lifting Karen onto a chair so she could see better. "Watching and learning is how we all figure out how to live." As they worked together to prepare their Christmas feast, Susan marveled at the completeness of her happiness. She had learned that damaged goods could be made whole again with patience and love, that broken pieces could be fitted back together into something even stronger than before. The auctioneer had called her damaged goods, and in a way, he had been right. She had been broken by loss and betrayal, worn down by hardship and desperation. But Lionel had seen past the damage to the woman beneath, had been willing to take every broken piece and help her rebuild herself into someone stronger and more complete than she had ever been before. Now she was the one helping others find their strength, offering sanctuary to those who needed it, and proving that the cycle of cruelty could be broken by simple acts of kindness and courage. As they sat down to their Christmas dinner, Lionel raised his glass of cider and a toast. "To second chances," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To the family we've built and the love that holds us together." "To second chances," Susan echoed, her heart full to overflowing. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their valley in pristine white and sealing them safely away from the harsh judgments of the world. Inside, the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, and the voices of her family filled the air with laughter and love. Susan Howard Wright had found her place in the world at last, not as damaged goods to be sold to the highest bidder, but as a woman of strength and courage, a protector of her family, and a beacon of hope for others who had lost their way. She had taken her broken pieces and built something beautiful from them, something that would endure long after the voices of her critics had been forgotten. The mountain man had roared his defiance at those who would diminish her, declaring his willingness to take every broken piece. But in the end, it was Susan herself who had done the real work of healing, who had found the strength to become whole again and to help others do the same. As the evening wore on and the children were tucked safely into their beds, Susan and Lionel sat by the fire and planned for the future. There would be more challenges, more people who needed help, more battles to fight against the cruelties of the world. But they would face them together, as a family, with love as their weapon and hope as their shield. The damaged goods had become priceless treasures, and the broken pieces had been forged into something unbreakable. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all.